He was a trusted police officer by day, and Russia's deadliest serial killer by night. The Siberian city of Angarsk looks ordinary on the surface. Rows of gray apartment blocks stand against the backdrop of frozen forests, the kind of place where life is simple, quiet, and repetitive. People worked, raised their families, and trusted the local police to keep order. And among those officers, one man stood out as dependable, approachable, and respected. Mikhail Popkov. To his colleagues, he was a model policeman. Punctual, obedient to the rules, always ready to take on long shifts. To his neighbors, he seemed like the perfect family man. He had a wife who adored him, a daughter he cherished, and a calm, almost humble personality that made him blend into the background. He carried himself like a man who believed in the law. But behind the neat uniform and polite smile lived a darkness that few could have imagined. Popkov was not just a policeman. He was also a predator, a man who would go on to become the most prolific serial killer in Russia's modern history, with nearly 80 confirmed victims, and possibly more. What made him truly terrifying was not only the number of lives he took, but how well he wore his disguise. He investigated thefts, domestic disputes, and drunken brawls during the day, and then used his very badge to lure women at night. He could stop a stranger on the street, flash his credentials, and instantly gain their trust. In a town where the police represented authority and safety, no one suspected that a murderer was walking among them in uniform. This double life created a chilling contrast. At home, Popkov played the role of a loving husband. He ate dinner with his wife, helped his daughter with her studies, and posed for family photos that showed nothing but warmth. His friends remembered him as quiet and polite, even dependable. Yet while they were laughing with him over a drink, or waving to him on the street, they had no idea that he had blood on his hands, sometimes from a crime committed just hours earlier. The city of Angarsk would eventually come to know him as the Werewolf, a name whispered with fear as bodies of young women were discovered in snowy fields and dark forests. But in these early years, no one could see the shadow behind his badge. Popkov's two identities lived side by side, and for nearly 2 decades, the mask never slipped. The story of Mikhail Popkov is not just about murder. It is about deception, the abuse of power, and the terrifying truth that monsters do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear the very uniform meant to protect us. And in the 1990s, as Russia struggled through crime and chaos after the fall of the Soviet Union, Popkov found the perfect environment to hide in plain sight. Part 1 sets a stage for a disturbing journey into the childhood, the psychology, and the crimes of a man who redefined the meaning of evil in modern Russia. Because this is not just the story of a killer. This is the story of how a protector became a predator, and how long it took before anyone dared to pull off his mask. Every predator has a beginning. And in the case of Mikhail Popkov, those beginnings trace back to his childhood in Angarsk, Siberia. He was born in 1964, in a city carved out of Soviet ambition. Rows of identical housing blocks, factories, and railroads connecting the remote region to the rest of Russia. Life was tough, cold, and disciplined. Families were expected to work hard, follow rules, and maintain appearances, and the Popkov family was no different. Outwardly, they looked ordinary, but behind closed doors, young Mikhail grew up in an environment where tension and control shaped his early worldview. Accounts of his upbringing reveal subtle but significant cracks. His father was distant, often harsh, while his mother ruled the household with authority. She worked at a factory and returned home exhausted but demanding. For Mikhail, the image of a dominant, sometimes cold woman became one of the first seeds of resentment. He learned to obey, to remain quiet, but deep inside, he began associating women with control, judgment, and punishment. As he grew older, these impressions hardened into something darker. Teachers remembered him as quiet and disciplined, but also withdrawn, lacking warmth or openness. He wasn't the boy to start fights, but neither was he the one to form close friendships. Instead, he cultivated a private world, one where feelings of inadequacy twisted into fantasies of control. By his teenage years, these inner tensions had become more visible. While his peers explored youthful romances and the excitement of growing up, Mikhail's experiences were marked by suspicion and detachment. He carried a quiet bitterness toward women, viewing them less as partners and more as symbols of judgment and betrayal. It was during these formative years that a dangerous seed began to take root. The idea of cleansing. Popkov developed a warped belief that some women were unfaithful, immoral, or corrupt, and that it was a man's duty to punish them. This wasn't yet a fully formed ideology, but the foundation of his later rationalizations was already there. When the time came for military service, Popkov embraced it. The Soviet army gave him structure, power, and most importantly, authority. For the first time, he experienced the feeling of commanding respect simply by wearing a uniform. He saw how quickly others obeyed, how rules bent for those in power, and he liked it. The shy, overlooked boy from Angarsk had found a mask that gave him control. After the army, he chose a career in law enforcement. Becoming a police officer wasn't just a job, it was the perfect stage for his developing psychology. The uniform became his shield, his identity, and eventually his hunting license. Colleagues saw him as serious and disciplined, but inside, he was feeding a darker narrative, that his role as an officer could justify acts of judgment. It is chilling to realize how natural the transition seemed for him. The very job designed to protect his community gave him exactly what he needed: access, trust, and authority. A young man with growing resentment toward women, equipped with the power of the badge, and hidden beneath the respectability of a family life. It was a combination that would one day unleash horror on Angarsk. The birth of a predator doesn't happen in a single moment. It is a gradual layering of resentment, desire, and opportunity. For Mikhail Popkov, those layers began forming in childhood, hardened during adolescence, and solidified once he put on the uniform. The shadow of the boy in Angarsk would soon become the shadow of a killer, and it wouldn't take long before he crossed the line from fantasy into blood-soaked reality. Every serial killer has a moment when thought becomes action. For Mikhail Popkov, that moment arrived in the early 1990s. A period of chaos across Russia. The Soviet Union had collapsed, law enforcement was struggling, and crime surged in cities like Angarsk. It was the perfect hunting ground for a man who wore the badge. The pattern of his crimes would soon become clear, but the first confirmed kill is where it all began. Like many of his later victims, she was a young woman walking home late at night. Vulnerable, cold, and likely tired. She was an easy target, and then she saw the flashing badge, the familiar figure of a police officer offering help. Popkov's approach was disarmingly simple. He pulled over in his police car, leaned out, and offered her a ride. In the Russia of that time, refusing such an offer was unusual. Police officers were authority, safety, order. For a woman alone in the dark, stepping into that car felt like protection. Instead, it became a death sentence. What happened next would mark the beginning of one of Russia's most horrifying killing sprees. Once the woman was in his control, Popkov turned predator. The drive took her away from the safety of lit streets, deeper into the outskirts, toward the forests and fields that bordered Angarsk. There, under the cover of night, his hidden fantasies erupted into violence. The brutality of the act was staggering. It wasn't just about killing. It was about dominance, humiliation, and destruction. He raped her, beat her, and left her broken body abandoned in the cold. For Popkov, this wasn't merely a crime. It was a release, a confirmation of the power he had always imagined. And then came the justification. In his twisted logic, this wasn't murder for pleasure. It was cleansing. He convinced himself that women who drank, who went out at night, who accepted rides from strangers, even from a policeman, were somehow impure, unworthy, and dangerous to the moral order. By killing her, he believed he was carrying out a kind of justice. But beneath that mask of justification was the true reason. Power. That first kill gave him something he had craved since childhood. Control. Complete and total dominance over another human life. The badge on his chest gave him the ability to lure. The violence in his heart gave him the ability to destroy. Afterwards, he returned home. His wife saw him as calm, maybe even tired from work. His daughter kissed him goodnight. Nobody saw the blood on his hands. Nobody sensed the monster that had just been born. And for Popkov, that was the most intoxicating part of all. The realization that he could live two lives without suspicion. The first murder is often the hardest for killers. It is the crossing of a line that can never be uncrossed. But for Mikhail Popkov, once the line was crossed, there was no turning back. That first taste of power was too sweet, too overwhelming. He had discovered his true addiction. In the months and years that followed, more women would step into his car, trusting the man in uniform. And just like the first, they would vanish into the night, never to return. The shadow behind the badge was no longer hiding. It was hunting. The uniform of a police officer is supposed to symbolize protection, duty, and justice. For Mikhail Popkov, it became something else entirely. Camouflage. His badge was not just a symbol of trust. It was his hunting license. Through the 1990s, Angarsk was a city in turmoil. Crime was rising. Law enforcement resources were thin, and social trust in institutions was shaky. But even in uncertain times, people respected the sight of a policeman. If one offered you a ride home late at night, you didn't question it. You felt relieved. That trust was exactly what Popkov preyed upon. Night after night, he drove the dark, snowy streets, scanning for his chosen victims. There were often women walking alone, sometimes after leaving a bar or a gathering. Vulnerable, tired, and trusting, they became easy prey. Popkov perfected his method. Pull up slowly, roll down the window, flash the badge, and offer help. Almost always, the woman stepped inside. The predator's work was half done before he even left the street. His colleagues, ironically, admired him for his dedication. He worked long shifts, volunteered for late-night patrols, and seemed committed to his duties. In truth, those long patrols gave him the perfect cover. He didn't need to sneak around or hide his movements. He was expected to be out at night, alone, driving the streets. The murders became part of his schedule, woven into the rhythm of his professional life. The brutality of his crimes escalated. Rape, beatings, mutilation, sometimes with weapons, sometimes with bare hands. The forests and frozen fields around Angarsk became silent graveyards, littered with the evidence of his rage. Some victims were found with such excessive violence that investigators struggled to comprehend the level of hatred behind the killings. And yet, back at the station, Popkov wore the face of a loyal officer. He even took part in the investigations of his own crimes. Imagine the cruel irony. A killer standing beside detectives, nodding seriously as they discussed evidence. Evidence that pointed to him. He knew the police procedures, the weak points in their methods, and used that knowledge to stay ahead. If suspicion drifted toward him, he smiled, deflected, and slipped back into the role of the dependable colleague. But whispers began to spread. Some officers noticed patterns, the locations of the bodies, the similarities between victims, the eerie timing of the murders with Popkov's patrols. They had no proof, no hard evidence, but the shadow of suspicion lingered. Still, no one dared to confront him directly. He was one of their own, a man who wore the same badge, swore the same oaths. The people of Angarsk began to whisper too. A monster was loose in their city. Women grew afraid to walk alone at night. Parents warned daughters not to trust strangers. But the cruelest truth was one no one wanted to believe. The very man they trusted most, the uniform they relied on, was the disguise of the predator himself. For nearly 2 decades, the uniform shielded him. Every salute, every nod of respect from a citizen, every handshake from a colleague. All of it gave him cover to keep killing. He was not just hunting in Angarsk. He was hunting with the law's protection wrapped around him. And with every successful kill, his confidence grew. The predator in uniform had become untouchable, or so he thought. A family man's mask to understand how Mikhail Popkov escaped suspicion for so long. You need to see the mask he wore at home. Because while Angarsk whispered about a werewolf haunting the night, his wife and daughter lived with a man they believed was ordinary, loving, and dependable. Popkov had married young, settling into what looked like the life of a stable family man. His wife, Elena, trusted him completely. 2 neighbors. She was the picture of loyalty, always speaking fondly of her husband, never suspecting the horrors hidden behind his uniform. Together, they raised a daughter who adored her father. By every outward measure, this was not the household of a killer. It was a normal Soviet family navigating the chaos of post-Soviet life. At home, he played the part perfectly. He shared meals at the kitchen table, fixed small household problems, and doted on his little girl. He attended family events, posed for photographs, and carried himself with quiet warmth. His daughter later remembered him as caring, protective, the kind of father who made her feel safe. This mask was more than just convenience. It was a psychological shield, allowing Popkov to compartmentalize his two lives. By day, he was a husband and father. By night, he was a predator. The contrast was so extreme that even those closest to him couldn't see through it. The loving gestures at home erased any flicker of suspicion. Friends and neighbors saw him as trustworthy. He was the kind of man you'd ask for help, moving furniture, or the one who gave polite nods in the stairwell. Co-workers might describe him as quiet, but reliable. He blended in so seamlessly that nobody would ever connect him to the brutalized bodies, turning up in nearby forests, and this duality gave him even greater confidence. Each time he returned home from a murder and slipped into the routine of family life, he proved to himself that he could control the mask. The predator and the family man coexisted without colliding. It was a performance he had perfected, one that made him all the more dangerous. Psychologists later pointed to this compartmentalization as one of the defining features of his psyche. He could kill with unimaginable cruelty, then come home and smile at his daughter's drawings. He could mutilate a woman in the night, then sit across from his wife in the morning and sip tea as though nothing had happened. To him, these were not contradictions. They were parallel roles, carefully separated in his mind. But beneath this mask, cracks were forming. His killings were not slowing down. They were escalating. The more he murdered, the more he needed the mask to remain intact. His family life wasn't just an alibi. It was part of the performance that allowed him to keep killing. In hindsight, the tragedy is chilling. Elena believes she was married to a policeman dedicated to justice. His daughter believes she was growing up with a protective father. Neighbors believed they lived next to a quiet, decent man, and all of them were unknowingly sharing their lives with Russia's most prolific serial killer. The family man's mask was convincing, but it was also fragile, and as the years went on, the darkness beneath it only grew stronger, more reckless, and more difficult to contain. Once the mask of a predator is secure, the violence beneath it tends to grow. For Mikhail Popkov, the 1990s became a decade of escalation. Years where killing went from isolated acts to an unstoppable pattern. His victims multiplied, his brutality intensified, and the city of Angarsk began to live in fear of a phantom no one could name. After his first murder, Popkov learned two things: how easily women trusted a policeman, and how quickly he could cover his tracks. That confidence emboldened him. Soon, one body became two became 5, and then the count climbed into the dozens. His method remained chillingly consistent: patrol the streets at night, watch for women walking alone, often those who had been drinking or seemed vulnerable, offer a ride, sometimes in his police car, sometimes in his personal vehicle, a friendly gesture, a protective figure, and once they were inside, the trap was sealed. But with each crime, his violence grew more savage. These were not just murders. They were acts of overkill, marked by rage, humiliation, and desecration. Victims were raped, beaten, stabbed, and mutilated. Some were found in forests, their bodies discarded in shallow snow. Others were dumped in remote fields, far from prying eyes. The brutality shocked, even hardened investigators, who struggled to imagine the mind capable of such acts. By the late 1990s, whispers began to ripple through Angarsk. Women were disappearing, then reappearing as corpses. Locals called the killer the werewolf, a monster haunting the city at night. Parents warned daughters not to accept rides, but who could imagine that the werewolf was a policeman, waving from behind a windshield, flashing a badge that symbolized safety. Inside the police force, unease grew. Detectives noted the growing number of similar cases. The methods, the locations, the victims, all pointed to a single hand at work. But without DNA technology at its peak, without clear evidence, their suspicions circled endlessly without landing. Some colleagues even wondered aloud if one of their own might be involved. Yet accusing a fellow officer without proof was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Popkov's personal life continued undisturbed. He attended family gatherings, celebrated birthdays, and lived in the same apartment blocks as his neighbors. Nobody could see that the quiet man next door was returning home from nights filled with blood. By the early 2000s, his kill count had reached staggering numbers. Officially, investigators would later confirm 78 murders, though some believe the true number could exceed 100. For nearly 2 decades, Angarsk became his hunting ground, the forests his dumping grounds, and his uniform the shield that kept him invisible. The brutality was no longer just physical. It was psychological warfare. The city lived in fear of an invisible predator, while the predator himself sat calmly in their midst, sipping tea, sharing smiles, and investigating the very crimes he committed. But every predator who escalates eventually makes mistakes. Forensic science was advancing. Survivors began to emerge, and the werewolf was about to discover that even the most careful mask cannot hold forever. For years, Mikhail Popkov killed, with near total impunity. His badge protected him, his mask of family life concealed him, and the disarray of post-Soviet law enforcement worked in his favor. But no predator is perfect forever. Even the most disciplined killer eventually stumbles. And when he did, the cracks in his carefully built double life began to show. The first shift came with science. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, forensic technology in Russia was advancing. DNA testing, though still in its early stages, was becoming a powerful weapon for investigators. Popkov's confidence had long relied on the chaos of evidence collection. Sloppy records, poorly stored samples, underfunded labs. But slowly, piece by piece, police began to realize that the bodies left in the forests around Angarsk carried hidden clues. Blood, hair, fibers. And if preserved correctly, these could one day speak louder than any witness. But science wasn't the only danger to Popkov. Survivors began to emerge. A handful of women managed to escape his attacks, either through luck, timing, or sheer will to live. Their stories painted a disturbing picture. A man who looked like a police officer, who offered them rides, who turned violent once they were alone. These accounts were vague, fragmented, and filled with trauma, but they planted a seed of suspicion. Could the killer truly be someone in uniform? Meanwhile, Popkov himself was growing careless. The thrill of killing had become an addiction, and with addiction comes recklessness. He began striking more frequently, sometimes leaving bodies in less remote places. Investigators noted sloppier disposal, evidence left behind, and inconsistencies in his attempts to cover his tracks. The predator, who once prided himself on control, was starting to unravel. Even his colleagues began whispering. Some noticed that he always seemed to know more about certain cases. Others questioned how his patrol routes often overlapped with crime scenes. Still, without hard evidence, suspicion remained locked behind closed doors. After all, accusing a fellow officer of being the werewolf was unthinkable without proof. The final turning point came not from one mistake, but from accumulation. Each sloppy kill, each escaped survivor, each fragment of evidence slowly built a case that could no longer be ignored. The police force could feel the net tightening, and some began to look inward. For Popkov, the signs were ominous, but instead of slowing down, he continued. He believed his mask was still too strong, his uniform too untouchable. That arrogance would cost him everything, because soon the werewolf would discover that even monsters cannot outrun time. DNA evidence was waiting for him, lying dormant in cold storage, ready to speak when the moment arrived. And when it did, the man who once hunted others would find himself hunted in return. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Angarsk was a city living in quiet fear. Women whispered about the disappearances, about bodies found in forests and ditches. Newspapers called the killer a maniac. Locals began to use another word, the werewolf. He was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom stalking Siberia's frozen streets. For years, investigators struggled in the dark. They had dozens of victims, but no clear suspect. The brutality was consistent. Strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, sexual violence. Yet there was no single lead strong enough to crack the case. A killer so methodical and careful must have known the tricks of investigation, and that was the cruelest irony. The werewolf wasn't just hiding among ordinary citizens. He was wearing the same badge as the men hunting him. Mikhail Popkov, the respected police officer, often attended the very meetings where his crimes were discussed. He knew the details of evidence, the theories being built, the progress, or lack of it. While his colleagues agonized over the lack of breakthroughs, Popkov sat silently, nodding, blending in. He even volunteered for certain assignments, a gesture that earned him trust. To his co-workers, he was diligent and professional. To his victims, he was death itself. But science was catching up. In the late 1990s, Russian forensic teams began experimenting with DNA profiling. Though it was slow and resource-heavy, the werewolf's crimes had left behind traces: blood, semen, hair. But in those days, the technology couldn't yet turn those clues into a face. Still, investigators preserved every sample, waiting for the day the tools would be ready. That day eventually came. In the early 2000s, a special task force was quietly formed, bringing together regional investigators, forensic experts, and criminal psychologists. They reviewed hundreds of case files, charting the killings over time and geography. A chilling pattern emerged. Many murders clustered around Angarsk, near routes familiar to police patrols and military bases. Whoever the killer was, he had intimate knowledge of the area. The abandoned spots where bodies would remain hidden for months, even years. Whispers spread within the force itself. Some officers began to suspect the unthinkable, that one of their own could be responsible. But suspicion was not proof. Accusing a fellow officer without evidence risked destroying careers and reputations. So the task force pressed on quietly, gathering every scrap of data, every tiny inconsistency. The breakthrough came in 2012. Advances in DNA testing allowed old samples from the crime scenes to be run against national databases. The results pointed in one chilling direction. The genetic material matched someone in the police registry. That someone was Mikhail Popkov. Investigators were stunned. This wasn't just a suspect. This was a colleague, a man many had worked alongside for years. Some had even trusted him with their families. Yet the science was irrefutable. The werewolf had been hiding in plain sight, using his uniform as both camouflage and weapon. The hunt was no longer about finding the killer. It was about closing in on a man who thought he was untouchable. Surveillance was placed on Popkov, who by then had retired from active police duty and was working odd jobs. He appeared quiet, ordinary, still living with his wife and daughter. Outwardly, nothing about him screamed serial killer. But the evidence was screaming louder than ever. And so, the net tightened. The werewolf who had stalked Siberia for 2 decades, who had left more than 80 victims in his wake, was finally within reach. The mask of respectability was about to crack, and the world would soon see the monster beneath the badge. In the interrogation room, something unexpected happened. Popkov began to talk, not with remorse, not with fear, but with a chilling calmness. He admitted to the murders as if he were describing routine police work. His words carried no hesitation, no shame. For the detectives listening, it was like hearing the weather report delivered by a man who had slaughtered dozens. "I cleansed them," he said, matter-of-factly. "These women were immoral, unfaithful, corrupt. I was purging the city." In his twisted worldview, he wasn't just a killer, he was an executioner, carrying out a warped sense of justice. He described his victims not as human beings, but as objects, symbols of betrayal and decay. To him, killing them wasn't murder. It was a duty. Detectives were horrified by how easily he recounted the acts. He remembered details vividly. The nights, the roads, the weapons. Sometimes he even smiled faintly as he spoke, not out of joy, but as if he were recounting a job well done. For the men and women questioning him, it was like staring into the abyss of a mind where empathy simply didn't exist. At first, he confessed to 22 murders. Investigators were stunned, but they knew the number was far higher. They pressed harder, reopening cold cases, matching DNA, cross-referencing his patrol records with the dates bodies had been found. Piece by piece, the true scale of his crimes began to emerge, and Popkov didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost proud to guide them through his history, as though, after decades of secrecy, He wanted his story to be heard. Not to apologize, but to have it recorded. He took investigators to old dumping grounds, revisited crime scenes, pointed out places where women had taken their last breaths. With every revelation, the horror deepened. The trusted family man, the respected officer, the quiet neighbor. He was gone. In his place stood the werewolf, baring his teeth at last. For the families of the victims, the confessions were both relief and devastation. Relief, because after years of silence, they finally had answers. Devastation, because those answers came with the realization that the killer had been hiding behind a badge of authority, someone they might have once greeted on the street. By the end of the interrogations, Popkov had confessed to dozens upon dozens of murders. At least 78 were confirmed with evidence. Some investigators believe the real number could cross 100. And through it all, he never expressed true regret. The closest he came was this: "I was like a hunter. When I saw prey, I had to act." The werewolf had finally been unmasked, but the shadow he cast over Angarsk, over Russia, and over the very idea of trust and authority, that shadow would remain long after his confession. When the trial of Mikhail Popkov began, the courtroom in Irkutsk was filled with a heavy, almost suffocating silence. Families of victims sat shoulder to shoulder, clutching photographs, rosaries, or simply each other's hands. Across from them sat the man they had feared for decades, the man who had haunted their city, stalked their daughters, and left their loved ones to rot in frozen forests. The werewolf had a face now, and it was calm, expressionless, disturbingly ordinary. Prosecutors laid out the charges in staggering detail. At first, Popkov was tried for 22 murders, enough to classify him among Russia's deadliest, but as the evidence mounted and his confessions expanded, the numbers grew. In time, he would be convicted of more than 80 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in modern Russian history. The trial revealed the full scale of his double life. The jurors heard how Popkov, once a respected police officer, used his badge as bait, how he exploited women's trust, how he carried out murders on nights when he was supposed to be on duty. They heard about the brutality, the stabbings, the axes, the strangulations, and about how his victims were often humiliated even in death. Witness after witness painted a picture of betrayal. Colleagues spoke of their disbelief. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, a devoted father. His daughter once, proud of her father the policeman, now faced the unbearable truth. Her protector had been a predator. Popkov himself was chillingly consistent. He did not beg for mercy. He did not plead insanity. Instead, he sat almost relaxed, occasionally explaining his actions with the same twisted logic he had offered police. He was cleansing society. Punishing women he deemed immoral. To him, this was not madness. It was mission. Psychiatrists evaluated him, searching for some explanation in the realms of mental illness. Their conclusion was even more terrifying than insanity. Popkov was sane. Fully aware of his actions, he chose his victims, planned his crimes, and understood the consequences. He wasn't driven by hallucinations or delusions. He was driven by ideology and desire. A man who killed not out of compulsion alone, but out of belief. When the sentence was delivered, the courtroom erupted. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. He would never again walk free. Yet for many, it was not enough. Some families demanded the death penalty. Others wept, knowing that no sentence could ever bring back their daughters, sisters, or mothers. Even in prison, Popkov remained an object of fascination and horror. He gave interviews, speaking with the same unsettling calm. He admitted to even more killings, raising his victim count higher and higher, as though the scale of his crimes gave him a twisted sense of accomplishment. Each new admission reopened old wounds, forcing families to relive their pain. To this day, Mikhail Popkov sits behind bars, a man stripped of his badge, but not of his monstrous legacy. His story is not only about one killer, it is about the betrayal of trust, the failure of systems, and the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary masks. Angarsk has moved on, its streets no longer stalked by the werewolf. But the memory lingers, in every shadow, in every police car offering a ride. People remember the years of fear, They remember that the man sworn to protect them was the one they should have feared most. The final truth of Mikhail Popkov is this: monsters do not always come from the outside. Sometimes they grow from within, hiding behind uniforms. Bane smiles, the illusion of normal life, and when the mask slips, the world is left to reckon with the unimaginable.